Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
it was late, far later than I should have been out. My boss had handed me a last-minute project, the kind that couldn't wait until morning. I was determined to finish it, but by the time I saved the final draft, the entire office had emptied. A glance at my phone confirmed what I already suspected. It was nearly midnight. I sighed heavily and rubbed my eyes, cursing myself for not keeping track of time. The idea of walking out to my car alone at this hour filled me with unease, but what choice did I have? The bus stops were deserted this late, and rideshares were unpredictable in my area. The office building felt different at night. During the day, it was alive with movement, filled with voices, laughter, and the steady hum of work. But now, the stillness felt oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards and distant hum of machinery made me jump. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and headed for the elevator. The long hallway leading to it seemed endless, my footsteps echoing ominously with each step. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, though I knew there was no one left on my floor. I pressed the button for the elevator and waited, my pulse quickening as I watched the floor numbers slowly tick down. When the doors slid open, I hesitated. The interior of the elevator seemed dimmer than usual. The overhead light flickered faintly, casting strange shadows against the metallic walls. I stepped inside, hugging my bag tightly, and pressed the button for the parking level. The ride down was excruciatingly slow. The elevator groaned and rattled, every jolt making my breath hitch. I found myself counting the seconds, trying to distract myself from the unease gnawing at my chest. When the doors finally opened, I was greeted by a blast of cold air. The parking garage was almost completely silent, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The garage was massive, with rows of concrete pillars stretching into the shadows. Most of the lights flickered or buzzed intermittently, casting uneven pools of light that made the shadows seem alive. My car was parked in the farthest corner, a decision I now regretted. At the time, it had seemed like a prime spot, easy to back out of and close to the exit ramp. But now, under the dim, flickery light, it felt like a trap. I stepped out of the elevator, my heels clicking against the concrete floor. The sound was deafening in the empty space, echoing back to me in jagged bursts. I clutched my keys tightly in my hand, the sharp edges of the fob digging into my palm. I'd heard enough horror stories to know that parking garages at night were the perfect setting for something terrible. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting between the rows of parked cars, scanning for any movement. About halfway to my car, I heard it, a faint shuffle of footsteps. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart lurching into my throat. The sound was so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. I turned slowly, my breath catching as I scanned the rows of cars behind me. Nothing, just endless concrete and yawning shadows. Hello, my voice trembled as it echoed off the walls. No answer. The silence that followed was suffocating. My ears strained for any sound, any sign that someone else was there. But the only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep walking, though every instinct screamed at me to run. My car was in sight now, just a few steps away. I fumbled with my keys, desperate to reach the relative safety of the locked doors. Then I heard it again. The footsteps were louder this time, heavier. They didn't match my pace. I turned sharply, and that's when I saw him. He was standing about 20 feet away, partially obscured by the shadow of a large SUV. My breath caught in my throat. He was tall and lanky, his posture slightly hunched. His clothes were filthy, stained, wrinkled, and ill-fitting, and his hair hung in greasy clumps around his pale face. But it was his smile that froze me in place. It was wide and unnatural, stretching across his face like a grotesque mask. His teeth gleamed faintly in the flickery light, and his dark, unblinking eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Can I help you?" I called out, though my voice cracked halfway through. He didn't answer. He didn't move. For a moment, I thought he might be a vagrant, someone looking for shelter. But there was something about him, something predatory in the way he stood there, perfectly still, his grin never wavering. Slowly, he tilted his head to the side, as if studying me. Then, without warning, he took a single step forward. That was all it took. I bolted for my car, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. My breath came in shallow, panic gasps as I fumbled to unlock the door. My fingers were shaking so badly that I dropped the key fob. The sound of it hitting the ground echoed like a gunshot. I scrambled to pick it up, my pulse racing as I cast a quick glance behind me. He was closer now, much closer. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. My hands fumbled for the lock, and the instant I pressed it, the satisfying click of the door's sealing felt like a small victory. Then I looked up. He was standing directly in front of my car. car. My stomach churned. He hadn't made a sound. He was just there. His grin was wider now, his teeth bared in a way that was almost animalistic. Slowly, deliberately, he raised one hand and waved. My entire body was trembling as I threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching against the concrete as I backed up. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just stood there, grinning, watching me as I sped toward the exit. It wasn't until I reached the ramp leading out of the garage that I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. He was gone. The drive home was a blur. Every shadow on the road, every set of headlights in the mirror sent a fresh wave of panic through me. When I finally reached my house, I locked every door and window, double-checked them, and sat in the corner of the living room clutching a kitchen knife. Sleep was out of the question. The next morning, I went straight to the building's security office. They took me seriously, probably because I looked like I hadn't slept in years. They pulled up the footage from the parking garage, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The man had been there the whole time. He'd been lurking in the shadows near the elevator when I stepped out, watching me. When I walked past, he followed, staying just far enough behind to avoid detection. The most chilly part, after I drove away, he didn't leave. He stood there for a while, staring at the exit ramp, before turning and walking deeper into the shadows, toward the far corner of the garage where the cameras didn't reach. The police were called, but they didn't find him. I don't stay late at the office anymore. I don't park in garages. Into the man with the crooked grin and silent footsteps, let's not meet. This happened 3 years ago, during my sophomore year of college. I went to a small liberal arts school surrounded by forest, endless, sprawling woods that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful during the day, peaceful and serene, but at night, it was different. The kind of different you feel in your gut but can't quite explain. I'd always liked the forest. It was my escape from the stress of classes, my little sanctuary where I could breathe, think, and just be alone. I'd go there to hike, read, or stargaze, and I never felt unsafe. At least, not until that night. It was late October, a chilly Friday night, and I'd just wrapped up a long study session in the campus library. The air outside was crisp, and the moon was nearly full, casting an eerie silver light over the campus. I felt restless, jittery from too much caffeine and too much time cooped up indoors. I needed to clear my head. Grabbing my flashlight and hoodie, I decided to take a quick walk on one of my favorite trails. The trail was familiar, a 2-mile loop that led to a clearing with an incredible view of the stars. I had been there countless times before, both alone and with friends, and I'd never had a reason to feel afraid. The first part of the hike was uneventful. The trail crunched under my boots, and the cool air filled my lungs. The forest was quiet, but not unnaturally so, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the path. About a mile in, though, something changed. The forest grew quieter, so quiet I could hear my own breathing. The usual background hum of crickets and distant rustling faded, replaced by a stillness that felt rugged. I stopped walking for a moment, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing. I laughed nervously to myself, brushing it off. Maybe the chill of the season had silenced the insects, or maybe I was just imagining things. I kept walking, though my pace quickened and my heart started to beat a little faster. When I reached the clearing, I felt a small wave of relief. The moonlight bathed the open space, illuminating the grass and the fallen log I always sat on. The stars above were breathtaking, scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. I switched off my flashlight and sat down, letting the stillness wash over me. But the stillness wasn't calming. Not tonight. It was heavy, oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the trees behind me. It wasn't the random scurry of a small animal or the whisper of wind through the leaves. It was deliberate, slow. I froze, my pulse quickening, and turning on my flashlight, I swept the beam across the tree line. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating gnarled branches and shifting shadows. Hello, I called, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe it was just a deer, or a raccoon, something harmless. I turned off the flashlight and tried to focus on the stars again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My senses felt heightened, every sound amplified in the suffocating silence. Then I heard its giggle. It was soft, high-pitched, and distinctly human. My stomach dropped. It didn't sound normal. It was too airy, too warped, like it was coming from far away and too close all at once. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. Who's there? I called, forcing my voice to sound steadier than I felt. No answer, just silence. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a faint, flickery light in the trees. It was small, like a flashlight, bobbing slightly as if someone was walking off trail. Relief flooded over me at first. Another hiker, I thought, someone else out here. But the light wasn't moving right. It would pause, then dart to the side, then back again. Erratic, unnatural. Hey, I called, waving my flashlight. Is someone there? The light stopped. My breath caught in my throat. For a long moment, everything was still. Then, the light jerked to the left, left, disappearing deeper into the woods. I didn't wait to see where it went. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. I turned and started back down the trail, walking quickly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every few steps, I heard it, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. It was subtle, faint, but it was there. Something or someone was following me. And then the giggle came again. This time, it was closer. I broke into a run, my flashlight bouncing wildly, casting chaotic shadows that seemed to twist and shift in the corners of my vision. The trail felt endless, the darkness pressing in around me. When I finally saw the lights of the campus ahead, I almost cried with relief. I sprinted the last stretch, bursting out of the woods and onto the manicured lawns of the quad. I didn't stop until I was inside my dorm, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My roommate looked up from her desk, startled. "What the hell happened to you?" she asked. I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. The sounds, the giggle, the light, it all sounded ridiculous, but I could see the concern on her face. "You said you went to the Claria?" she asked, her voice tight. "Yeah," I replied, my hands still shaking. "Why?" Her face paled. "That's where they found that girl last year, the one who went missing. They found her body just off the trail, near the clearing." I stared at her, my blood turning to ice. "They never caught the guy who did it," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that giggle. For weeks, I avoided the woods entirely. Every time I passed the trailhead, I felt that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. To whoever or whatever was in the woods that night, let's not meet. 2 years ago, I moved to a new city, desperate for a fresh start. My life had unraveled, a failed relationship, a job I hated, and a growing sense that my small town life was closing in on me. I needed to get away, and moving felt like the only solution. The city was supposed to be my new beginning, vibrant, exciting, full of possibilities. But the truth was, starting over wasn't as freeing as I had imagined. I spent most of my time alone, trying to get my bearings. Evenings were the worst. I'd wander the streets near my apartment or camp out at the coffee shop a few blocks away, pretending I had somewhere to be or someone to meet. The shop became my sanctuary, a warm, quiet place where I could distract myself from the loneliness of starting over. It was a Friday night in late fall when it happened. I had stayed at the coffee shop longer than usual, completely absorbed in writing and sipping on my 4th cup of coffee. By the time I glanced at the clock, it was nearly midnight. The shop was almost empty, and the barista was starting to wipe down tables and stack chairs. I packed up my things, thanked them on my way out, and stepped into the cold night air. The streets were eerily quiet, even for this part of town. Most of the shops were dark, their windows reflecting the glow of the streetlights. The occasional car passed by, but the block was largely deserted. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that seeped into your skin and made you wish you'd worn another layer. My breath puffed out in little clouds as I started the short walk home. Normally, I would have taken the main road, a well-lit street lined with businesses and the occasional late-night straggler. But I was tired, and the shortcut through a nearby alley would shave 10 minutes off my walk. I'd taken it during the day plenty of times. It wasn't particularly inviting, but it seemed harmless enough. I hesitated for a moment, then turned toward the alley. As soon as I stepped into the narrow space, a sense of unease crept over me. The alley was darker than I remembered. The faint light from the street barely reached past the entrance, leaving the space ahead cloaked in shadow. The air here felt colder, damp, and heavy with the smell of wet pavement and something metallic. I shook off the feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid. It was just an alley, a shortcut. I'd be home soon. My boots clicked against the pavement, the sound bouncing off the brick walls on either side of me. I focused on the faint glow of the exit ahead, trying to ignore the shadows that seemed to press in closer with every step. I was halfway through when I heard it, a faint scuff behind me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound had been quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Slowly, I turned around, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. Nothing. The alley stretched out empty behind me, the shadows unmoving. My chest tightened as I scanned the space, my heart pounding in my ears. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky and far too loud in the silence. There was no answer. I laughed nervously, the sound hollow and forced. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. It was probably just an echo, or maybe a stray cat. I turned back toward the exit and started walking again, faster this time. Then I heard it again, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. I didn't turn around this time. My instinct screamed at me to keep moving, but panic was clawing at my chest. "Hello," I called out again, louder this time, my voice trembly. "Who's there?" Silence. The footsteps stopped, but I could feel it, someone was there, watching me. My hands tightened around the strap of my bag as I forced myself to keep walking, each step faster than the last. The exit was just ahead. I could see the street lights glowing faintly through the narrow opening. Hey, a man's voice called out behind me, low and casual. Wait up. My blood ran cold. His tone was calm, almost playful, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. I didn't respond. I didn't look back. I read. My boots pounded against the pavement as I sprinted toward the exit, my bag bouncing against my side. My breath came in short, panic gasps, my lungs burning as I pushed myself harder. Behind me, I could hear him running too, his footsteps heavy and fast, closing the distance. I burst out of the alley and onto the main street, the bright lights and open space feeling like a lifeline. My apartment building was just ahead. I ran for the door, fumbling with my keys as I reached it. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped them twice before finally shoving the key into the lock. I slipped inside and slammed the door shut, my chest heaving as I locked the deadbolt. For a moment, I just stood there, pressed against the door, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but something told me to look. I moved to the small window next to the door, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. He was there. The man stood across the street under a flickering street light. He was tall, his hood pulled low over his face. He didn't move, but his posture was tense, like a predator watching its prey. Even though his face was obscured, I could feel his eyes on me, cold, calculating, unrelenting. I stood frozen, staring back at him. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise made me jump, and every shadow seemed alive. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, wondering what he would have done if I hadn't run. The next morning, I filed a police report, but without a clear description or evidence, there wasn't much they could do. A month later, I saw a news report. A woman had been attacked in that same alley. She survived, but just barely. Her description of the attacker: tall, wearing a dark hoodie. To this day, I wonder if he had been watching me before that night, waiting for the right moment. I avoid that alley now, even during the day. I'm more cautious, constantly checking over my shoulder and staying in well-lit areas. But no matter what I do, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there. To the man who chased me through the alley, and to whoever else he might be stalking, let's not meet. Ever. This happened about 6 months ago, but it's still as vivid in my mind as the night it happened. I'm a 24-year-old woman, and I work the late shift at a diner about 30 minutes from my house. The drive home is usually quiet, long stretches of empty rural roads with no traffic, no streetlights, and barely any signs of life at that hour. Normally, it doesn't bother me. If anything, I find it kind of calming. But that night was different. It was a little past 1:30 a.m., and my gas light came on just as I was halfway home. I groaned out loud because I knew exactly what that meant. There's only one gas station open that late on my route, and it's not the kind of place you stop at unless you absolutely have to. It's this old, run-down station in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights buzz and flicker, and the air smells faintly of burnt oil and stale cigarettes. But I didn't have a choice. I couldn't risk running out of gas on a deserted road. When I pulled into the lot, something immediately felt off. The place was completely empty except for one car, a beat-up, rusted sedan parked near the side of the building. Its windows were so filthy I couldn't see if anyone was inside. I parked at the pump closest to the exit, keeping my engine running for a moment as I scanned the area. The lights above the pump were flickering, casting eerie shadows across the cracked asphalt. I told myself I was being paranoid. I just needed gas, and then I'd be on my way. I got out and started pumping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air was so still, so quiet, that the sound of the gas flowing into my tank felt deafening. That's when I saw him. He stepped out from behind the rusted sedan, and I swear to God, it felt like he materialized out of thin air. He was tall and thin, with greasy hair that hung in uneven clumps around his face. His clothes were filthy, a stained flannel shirt and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. But it was his face that really unnerved me. His eyes were glassy, bloodshot, and wide with this manic energy. And his grin, it wasn't friendly. It was twisted, like he was savoring some private joke that only he understood. "Late night for a pretty girl like you," he said, his voice raspy and low. My heart dropped into my stomach. He was standing too close, just on the other side of the pump, and I hadn't even noticed him until he spoke. I forced a polite smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, just heading home from work." He didn't say anything for a moment, just kept staring at me with that unsettling grin. Then he took a step closer, and I instinctively moved back a little, bumping into my car. "You live around here?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. His grin widened, showing teeth that were yellowed and crooked. "I could follow you. Make sure you get home safe." My blood turned to ice. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I didn't want to provoke him. "No, that's okay," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm fine." He didn't move, just stood there staring at me with those unblinking eyes. The pump clicked, signaling that my tank was full, and I've never moved faster in my life. I yanked the nozzle out, spilling gas on the ground in my haste, and shoved it back into the pump without bothering to put the cap on my tank. As I turned to open my car door, I saw him step closer again, and that's when I noticed what he was holding. A knife, a small, shiny blade that he was twirling lazily between his fingers, like he was toying with it. "Don't be in such a rush," he said, his tone mocking. "We're just getting to know each other." I didn't respond. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked, but somehow I managed to fling it open and throw myself inside. I locked the doors and started the engine in one motion. The man just stood there, watching me with that same twisted grin, the knife glinting in the flickering light. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror, praying he wouldn't follow. But a minute later, my worst fear came true. Headlights appeared behind me. It was the rusted sedan. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was leaving too. But as I turned onto the main road, the car stayed right behind me. I took a random left turn, and so did they. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I turned onto a dirt road I'd never been on before, driving faster than I should have, but he was still there, his headlights growing brighter in my mirror. Panic set in. I didn't know where I was or how to lose him. The road was narrow, with dense trees on either side, and I couldn't risk stopping. Suddenly, I saw a break in the trees up ahead, a small driveway leading to a cluster of houses. Without thinking, I turned onto it, killed my lights, and pulled into the shadows. I held my breath as the sedan sped past. For a moment, I thought he might stop or turn back, but he didn't. The headlights disappeared into the distance, and I sat there in silence, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I dared to move. When I finally pulled back onto the road, I didn't head home. Instead, I drove to a well-lit 24-hour grocery store and parked near the entrance. I stayed there for over an hour, my heart still racing, watching every car that came and went. I never saw the man or his car again, but I can't stop thinking about how close I came to whatever he had planned. I've stopped working late shifts since then, and I'll never stop at that gas station again. After that night, I couldn't shake the unease. It wasn't just the encounter, it was the lingering feeling that I'd been marked somehow. Every time I drove home, I found myself checking my mirrors obsessively, half expecting to see those rusted headlights trailing behind me again. For the first couple of weeks, I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering if I should have done something differently. Maybe I should have gone to the police, but what would I have told them? A creepy guy with a knife at a gas station followed me. There was no license plate that I could remember, no clear evidence of the crime, just fear. I tried to go back to normal, but the smallest thing set me off. I avoided back roads completely, even though it made my drive home longer. I started parking as close as I could to the diner's entrance, sprinting to my car at the end of every shift. I even switched up my routine, taking different routes home every few nights. Still, the paranoia lingered. About a month later, something happened that made me question if I'd truly escaped. It was a Friday night, and I had the weekend off, so I stayed at my friend Carly's place for a movie night. By the time I left her house, it was just after midnight. I didn't think much of it at first. Carly lived in a well-lit suburban neighborhood, and I figured I'd be fine on the way home. But as I turned onto the highway, I noticed a car behind me. It was an old, rusted sedan. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the exact same car. I couldn't be sure, but it was close enough to make my hands tighten on the wheel. The headlights stayed a steady distance behind me, not too close, not too far. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. After all, people drive rusted cars all the time, but when I switched lanes, so did they. When I slowed down, so did they. My breathing grew shallow as the dread crept in. Was it him? Was he watching me this whole time, waiting for the right moment? I turned onto an exit I never take, heading into unfamiliar streets, hoping to lose the car. For a moment, I thought it worked. The headlights disappeared when I made a sharp turn down a residential road. My heart began to slow as I made my way back toward the highway, but as I approached the intersection, the rusted sedan appeared again, coming from a side street. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to do. My phone was in my bag, out of reach, and the last thing I wanted was to pull over, so I did the only thing I could think of. I drove to the police station. I don't think I've ever felt so relieved as when I saw the bright blue and red lights of the station. I pulled into the lot, parked, and sat there with my heart pounding. The sedan slowed as it passed, lingering just long enough for me to get a glimpse of the driver. It was a man. I couldn't see much in the darkness, but I saw his silhouette, a tall, lanky figure, and my mind immediately flashed back to the gas station. Was it him, or was I just imagining it? The car sped off before I could think to get the license plate. I went inside the station, shaking as I explained what had happened. The officer on duty was polite but didn't seem too concerned. Without a plate or a clear description, there wasn't much they could do. He told me they'd keep an eye out but suggested it was probably just a coincidence. but I knew better. Since that night, I've changed everything. I moved to a different apartment in a more populated area, and I quit my job at the diner. It's been months, and I haven't seen the rusted sedan again, but I still can't let my guard down. Every time I see an old car or catch someone staring at me for too long, my chest tightens, and I feel that same wave of panic. I don't know who that man was or why he chose me, but the thought that he might still be out there, watching, waiting, it's enough to keep me awake at night. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that grin. That's when I remind myself, he didn't win, I escaped, I'm safe, but deep down, I'm not sure I'll ever really feel safe again. This happened about 2 years ago, and even now, it still creeps me out whenever I think about it. For context, I'm a 28-year-old woman, and at the time, I was living in a small college town, working late shifts at a bookstore cafe. The pay wasn't great, but I loved the quiet atmosphere and my coworkers. The downside, I didn't have a car and couldn't afford rides every night, so I had to walk home. Normally, it wasn't an issue. The route I took was a straight shot down Main Street, which was usually well lit and relatively busy, even late at night. But one night, I made a decision I'll never forget. I decided to take a shortcut. I'd used it a few times before without any problems. It cut through a quiet residential area, saving me about 15 minutes. It wasn't sketchy or anything, just rows of houses with neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. But that night, it felt different. The neighborhood seemed darker than usual, like half the street lights were out. There were no porch lights on, no cars passing by, not even the distant sound of a dog barking. The only noise was the rhythmic clack of my boots against the pavement. About halfway through the block, I got the sense that I wasn't alone. You know that feeling, like a sixth sense kicking in, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I glanced over my shoulder and didn't see anything, just the empty street stretching behind me, bathed in dim orange light. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Then I saw him, a man, walking toward me from the other end of the block. He was tall, wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up and his hands shoved deep in the pockets. At first, I didn't think much of it. People walk at night all the time, but as he got closer, something about him felt and his movements were slow, deliberate, almost like he was pacing himself. And he wasn't walking in a straight line. He was weaving slightly, like he was trying to figure out which side of the street he wanted to be on. I didn't want to take any chances, so I crossed to the opposite sidewalk. As I did, he just stopped in the middle of the street, standing there like a statue. His head turned slightly, following me as I moved, but he didn't say a word. My heart was pounding as I picked up my pace, trying to act casual but feeling more exposed with every step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and each time, he was still standing there, watching me. Then, as if on cue, he started walking again, but now he was on my side of the street. That's when the fear really hit. He wasn't just walking, he was mirroring me. Every time I sped up, so did he. When I slowed down, he adjusted his pace to match mine. But the creepiest part, he wasn't making any noise. No footsteps, no shuffle of his clothes, nothing. It was like he wasn't even there, except I could feel him. I thought about running, but my brain was stuck in that fight or flight freeze mode. Instead, I pulled out my phone and pretended to make a call, hoping it would deter him. I held the phone to my ear, whispering into it as if I were talking to someone. "Hey, I'm almost home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you meet me outside?" The man didn't react. He just kept walking, that same slow, deliberate pace. My stomach was in knots. I tried to focus on getting to the end of the block, where the street opened up into a main road with better lighting. I told myself that if I could just get there, I'd be safe. But then, he stopped again. This time, he was directly across the street from me, standing under one of the few working streetlights. His hood was still up, casting his face in shadow, but I could see the way his head tilted slightly to the side, like he was studying me. He called out, his voice low and almost playful. "Where are you headed?" I ignored him, my heart racing. I didn't want to show him I was scared, but I couldn't stop my hands from trembling. I quickened my pace, gripping my bag tightly and praying I could make it to the end of the street before he tried anything. "Don't be like that," he called again, louder this time. "I just want to talk." I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep moving, to get out of there. Finally, I reached the corner and turned onto the main road, where the bright lights of a convenience store came into view. I felt a wave of relief as I jogged toward it, my eyes darting around to make sure he wasn't following me. When I glanced back, the street behind me was empty. He was gone. I didn't stop to question it. I went straight into the convenience store and stayed there for almost an hour, pretending to browse the aisles while keeping an eye on the door. I didn't see him again that night, but the experience left me shaken. I took a cab home, even though though it cost more than I could really afford. For weeks after, I couldn't walk home without looking over my shoulder. I avoided that shortcut completely, sticking to the well-lit main roads no matter how late it was. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even in broad daylight, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows that didn't seem right. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia after all. The man hadn't followed me into the store, and I hadn't seen him since. But something about the way he moved, how he watched me, left a mark I couldn't forget. 2 weeks passed, and life started to feel normal again. I stuck to Main Street on my walks home, and I started carrying pepper spray in my pocket, just in case. For a while, it seemed like everything was fine, until it wasn't. One night, I stayed late at the bookstore cafe to help with an inventory update. By the time I locked up, it was well past midnight. The street was quieter than usual, and I felt that familiar unease creeping in. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the hum of the streetlights sounded louder than it should have. As I walked, I kept my head down, my fingers wrapped tightly around the pepper spray in my pocket. I tried to focus on the sounds around me, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional rustle of leaves. But then I heard something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and just far enough behind me to make my skin crawl. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to know, but I couldn't stop myself. I glanced over my shoulder, and my heart dropped. It was him, the same hooded figure, walking at that same unnervingly slow pace. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, but I knew it was him. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, that same sickening dread I'd felt the first time I saw him. I turned back around and quickened my pace, my boots clacking loudly against the pavement. The footsteps behind me sped up to match mine. I clutched my pepper spray tighter, my breathing growing shallow. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but my phone was buried in my bag, and I didn't dare stop. The street ahead of me was empty, the nearest open store still several blocks away. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I spotted an alley up ahead and debated whether to duck into it, but the thought of being cornered made my stomach churn. Instead, I kept walking, my eyes darting to every shadow, every parked car, hoping to find some kind of escape. Then, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I risked another glance over my shoulder, but he was gone. The street was empty again, just like before. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't trust it. I knew he was still there, watching, waiting. I practically ran the rest of the way to the convenience store. When I burst through the doors, the cashier gave me a startled look, but I didn't care. I stayed inside for almost an hour, pacing the aisles and pretending to shop. When I finally stepped outside, the street was still empty, but the sense of relief didn't come this time. I knew he was out there, somewhere, and that he'd followed me again. For the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Was it just a coincidence? Or was he deliberately targeting me? The thought of seeing him again made my skin crawl, but the thought of never seeing him again was almost worse, like he could be anywhere, lurking, waiting for the perfect moment. A week later, I woke up to a knock at my door. It was early, barely light out, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart sank as I crept to the peephole. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty hallway of my apartment building. Then I looked down. There was something on the floor, a small, folded piece of paper, weighted down by a single black button. I didn't want to touch it. My hands were shaking as I stared at it, the weight of dread settling over me. Finally, I grabbed a pair of kitchen tongs and picked up the paper, careful not to touch it with my bare hands. I unfolded it slowly, and my stomach turned when I saw what was written inside. "Why don't you take the shortcut tonight?" That was it. No name, no explanation, just that one sentence scrawled in jagged handwriting. The black button felt like some kind of marker, a token of his presence. I didn't know how he'd found me, but he had, and that meant nowhere was safe. I packed a bag that same day and left town, crashing at a friend's place in another city while I tried to figure out what to do. I quit my job at the cafe and never went back to that apartment. Even now, I check my doors and windows obsessively, and I don't walk alone at night, no matter how safe the area seems. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'm certain of one thing: he wasn't just a random stranger. He was a predator, and I was his prey. And sometimes, late at night, I still wonder if he's out there, waiting for me to make one wrong move. This happened last fall, and I still get chills thinking about it. I had just moved to a small, quiet town for work, a place where people still leave their doors unlocked during the day and wave to strangers. I thought it would be a fresh start, somewhere peaceful where I could focus on myself. I found a little cottage on the edge of town. It was charming in a rustic way, with a wraparound porch and an old rocking chair left by the previous tenant. Behind the house was a dense forest that stretched for miles. During the day, it was picturesque, but at night, the woods seemed to come alive, the trees casting long, menacing shadows shadows. About a month after I moved in, it was a cool October evening, and I was sitting on the porch with a glass of wine. The air smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. I was scrolling through my phone, enjoying the stillness, when I noticed something move out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a deer. The woods were full of them, and they often wandered close to the house. But when I turned to look, I saw a man dressed in dark clothes standing just inside the tree line. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the shadows. His face was pale, but I couldn't make out any features from where I was sitting. I froze, my heart racing. Who just stands in the woods like that? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Can I help you? No response. He just stood there, staring. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and waved. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was slow and deliberate, like he was mocking me. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to go inside, but I didn't want to show him I was scared. Instead, I stood up and took a step closer to the edge of the porch. "Hey, you need to leave," I shouted. He tilted his head, like he was amused, then turned and walked back into the woods without a word. I locked every door and window that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound outside, footsteps on the porch. I shot up in bed, my pulse hammering. The porch light was off, but moonlight streamed through the curtains, casting faint shadows on the walls. Then came a tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the window in my bedroom. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I crept to the window, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and pulled the curtain back just a sliver. He was there, the man from the woods, his face inches from the glass. His features were clearer now, deep-set eyes, stringy hair, and a grin that stretched too wide, showing yellowed, crooked teeth. He stared at me like he was savoring the moment. "Hi," he said, his voice muffled but clear enough to make my blood run cold. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the corner of my bed. How did he go by name? I'd never seen him before, and I hadn't spoken to many people since moving here. My hand shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. Before the dispatcher picked up, he spoke again. "You shouldn't have moved here," he said, his grin never faltering. I blinked, and he was gone. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found no signs of anyone being outside, no footprints, no disturbed foliage, nothing. They told me it was probably a prank, maybe a local trying to scare the newbie. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after that. For weeks, I jumped at every noise, every shadow. I kept the curtains drawn and the doors locked, but it didn't matter. The feeling of being watched never went away. I moved out of that cottage after 2 months. The landlord acted surprised when I told him why, but as I was leaving, he said something that stuck with me. "You're not the first tenant to leave early." I never pressed him for details. After moving out of the cottage, I tried to put it all behind me. I found a small apartment in the center of town, away from the woods and far from the cottage, unsettling isolation. It was smaller and noisier, but the hum of passing cars and distant chatter made me feel safe. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. I started to convince myself that it really was just a prank, some local weirdo messing with me. But then little things started happening. It began with phone calls. At first, they were silent. I'd answer, only to hear faint static on the other end before the caller hung up. Then, one evening, a call came in while I was watching TV. I let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another telemarketer. But when I played it back, all I heard was slow, deliberate breathing, and then, just before it ended, a voice. "You can't hide." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was raspy, but unmistakable. It was him. I immediately called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. The number was untraceable, a burner phone. They said they offered to send a patrol car by my apartment for a few nights, but I could tell they thought I was overreacting. Then came the package. It arrived one morning, left on my doorstep without a return address. I remember staring at it for a long time before finally bringing it inside. The box was small and wrapped in brown paper, the kind you find at a hardware store. My name was scrawled on the top in a messy, almost childlike handwriting. I hesitated, debating whether to open it. Finally, curiosity and dread won out. Inside was a single item, a Polaroid photo. It was a picture of me taken through the window of my new apartment. In the photo, I was sitting on my couch, completely unaware. I dropped the photo, my hands trembling. He had found me. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows sent me into a panic. I kept all the lights on and sat in the corner of my bedroom, clutching a heavy flashlight as if it could somehow protect me. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I called in sick to work and started packing, but before I could leave, the tapping started again. It was late afternoon, and I was in my kitchen, stuffing dishes into a box, when I heard it, soft, deliberate taps against the sliding glass door that led to the balcony. Tap, tap, tap. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned to look. He was there, standing on the other side of the glass. His face was pressed so close that it distorted, his crooked teeth bared in that same unsettling grin. "Going somewhere," he said, his voice muffled but unmistakable. I didn't think, I just ran. I grabbed my car keys and bolted for the front door, leaving everything behind. As I sped out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was standing in the middle of the street, watching me drive away. I didn't stop driving until I was 3 towns over, pulling into the first motel I could find. I stayed there for a week, too scared to go back to my apartment. Eventually, I contacted a movie company to retrieve my things for me. I've since moved across the country to a place where no one knows my name. I changed my number, deleted all my social media, and even started going by a different nickname. For a while, I felt safe again, but last week, I found another package waiting for me at my new address. Inside was another Polaroid. It was a picture of me, asleep in my new bed. I stared at the Polaroid for what felt like an eternity. My blood turned ice cold, my hands trembling so hard I almost dropped it. This was supposed to be my safe place, far from anyone who knew me, or so I thought. Somehow, he had found me again. For the first time since this nightmare started, I broke down. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to figure out what to do. I couldn't run again. Wherever I went, he seemed to follow, like he always knew where I'd be next. The motel felt suffocating after that. Every sound outside my room, the rumble of passing cars, the chatter of other guests, felt like a threat. I couldn't even bring myself to sleep. Instead, I sat in the corner of the room, clutching my phone and staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. I called the police again, this time in my new town, and tried to explain what was happening. But once again, there wasn't much they could do. They told me I'd need to file a restraining order against who I didn't even know. The officer on the phone sounded sympathetic but skeptical. This could just be an elaborate prank. He said, "Is there anyone in your life who might have a grudge against you?" I couldn't answer. There was no one. The following night, things escalated. I had finally drifted off to sleep when I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart leapt into my throat as I scrambled to sit up, my eyes darting around the room. It sounded like it had come from the bathroom. For a moment, I thought maybe something had fallen, a loose towel rod or a faulty shelf. But then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving closer. The door to the bathroom creaked open, and I saw a shadow stretch across the wall. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced as I searched for anything to defend myself, my fingers closing around the base of the motel lamp. The footsteps stopped just short of the bed, and then the voice, "You can't keep running." That was all it took. I screamed and swung the lamp with all my strength, sending it crashing into the figure standing over me. There was a guttural sound, something between a laugh and a grunt, before the shadow stumbled back. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I grabbed my bag and bolted out the door, barefoot and still in my pajamas. The motel clerk gave me a confused look as I ran past the front desk, but I didn't stop. I jumped into my car and drove into the night. That's where things start to get strange. I drove for hours, taking random turns and avoiding main roads. I didn't have a plan, I just wanted to get away. Eventually, I found myself in a rural area, the kind where streetlights are rare and the road seems to stretch forever. And that's when I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just feet away from him. This time, he wasn't grinning. His face was blank, almost sad. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine through the windshield. "You should have stayed," he said, his voice low and haunting. I threw the car into reverse, but before I could move, everything went black. Not like I fainted, this was different. One moment, I was staring at him, the next, I was waking up in my car, parked on the side of the road. The sun was rising, and the man was gone. I checked the time on my phone, 4:47 a.m. somehow. I'd lost over 4 hours. My car was undamaged, and everything inside was exactly as I'd left it. But there was one new addition, another Polaroid, resting on the passenger seat. It showed me, sitting in my car, asleep. I don't know what's happening to me or why he's doing this. It's been weeks since that night, and I've heard nothing from him. Hey everyone, long time lurker, first time poster here. I always loved reading everyone else's creepy experiences, but I never thought I'd have one of my own to share. That changed a few weeks ago. Even now, my hands are shaking as I type this. For context, I live in a rural area surrounded by dense woods. It's quiet, peaceful, and far removed from the chaos of city life. I love taking long walks through the trails behind my house, especially in the evenings when the world seems to quiet down. Until recently, those walks were my favorite part of the day. It was a Tuesday Thursday night. Around 7:30 p.m. the sun was setting and the woods were bathed in this eerie orange light. I was about halfway through my usual loop when I heard it, a soft voice calling my name, and I froze mid-step. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The wind can play tricks on you when it rustles through the trees. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, and help me. The voice was coming from deeper in the woods, off the main trail. It sounded faint, like whoever it was had been calling for a long time and was running out of energy. My first instinct was to call back, but something stopped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stood there, debating what to do, when I noticed how quiet the woods had become. No birds, no insects, just silence. My gut told me to turn around and go home, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the trail, carefully making my way toward the voice. As I moved closer, I saw him, a man standing in a small clearing. He was tall, with messy hair and clothes that looked torn and dirty, like he'd been out there for days. He wasn't looking at me, just staring off into the distance. Then, without turning his head, he said my name again, and my heart dropped. How did he know my name? I was about to ask him if he was okay when he finally turned to look at me. His eyes were they were too big, and the whites were grayish, like they'd been clouded over. His smile was even worse, wide and toothy, stretching too far across his face. "Why don't you come closer?" he said, his voice oddly calm. I took a step back. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" His smile grew wider. "I've always known you, Anna." At that point, every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. I turned and bolted back toward the trail, branches snagging at my clothes as I ran. The whole time, I could hear him behind me. His footsteps were heavy, but they didn't sound like they were on the ground. It was like he was running just above it. When I finally reached the trail, the footsteps stopped. I didn't dare look back. I sprinted all the way home, slammed the door shut, and locked it. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there watching me. The next day, I went back to the woods with a friend, hoping to find some sign of what had happened, footprints, torn clothes, anything. But the clearing where I'd seen him didn't exist. It was just more trees. After a few days, I started convincing myself that maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was overworked, or the solitude of living near the woods was getting to me. I'd even started drafting a text to my therapist about it, but never sent it. I didn't want to sound crazy, but then the noises started. It began subtly, like a faint tapping on my bedroom window late at night. I live in a single-story house, so the idea of someone or something being outside that close sent chills through me. The first time I heard it, I dismissed it as tree branches in the wind, but it happened again the next night. In the night after that, on the fourth night, the tapping wasn't faint anymore. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was knocking on the glass with their knuckles. I sat frozen in bed, staring at the window, willing myself not to look. I told myself it was an animal, a bird, maybe, but deep down, I knew better. And the voice came again, so close this time it felt like whoever, or whatever it was right next to me. My blood turned to ice. I grabbed my phone, trying to dial 911, but my hands were trembling so much I almost dropped it. The voice called my name again, softer now, but somehow clearer. And then it said something new. "Why did you leave me?" I screamed. I couldn't help it. The moment I did, the tapping stopped, and the air outside felt unnervingly silent. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the blinds, there was no one there, just my dark, empty backyard. The next morning, I checked the window for any signs, footprints, smudges, anything, but there was nothing. No marks on the glass, no disturbed dirt under the window. It was as if nothing had happened at all. I decided to stay with a friend in town for a while. I told them I just needed a break from the isolation of living alone in the woods. I didn't mention the voice or the tapping. I was too embarrassed, and honestly, I didn't think they'd believe me. For a few nights, things were normal. I started to feel safe again, like maybe the whole thing had been a bad dream. But last night, it happened again. I was in the guest room, scrolling on my phone before bed, when I heard it. The same voice, distant but unmistakable, and I'm still here. The sound wasn't coming from outside this time. It was coming from inside the house. I froze. My friend was asleep in the next room, and I didn't want to wake them, but I couldn't ignore it. I quietly got up and opened the door, peeking out into the hallway. The house was dark and still. Nothing seemed out of place, but the voice came again, closer now. And I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a lamp, and crept toward the sound. My heart was racing, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the living room, I flipped on the light. It was empty, but then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the coffee table was a piece of paper, folded neatly. I didn't remember seeing it there before. With trembling hands, I picked it up and unfolded it. Inside, in shaky handwriting, were 3 words, "Du Camp High." I dropped the note like it was burning my hands and stumbled back, nearly tripping over the corner of the rug. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. The house was still completely silent, but now it felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. And the voice came again, and this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty hallway leading to the bedrooms. My hands clenched the lamp tighter as I backed toward my friend's room, whispering their name. Sarah, I hissed, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah, wake up. I didn't dare take my eyes off the hallway as I reached for her doorknob, but when I turned it and pushed, the door wouldn't budge. Locked. That didn't make any sense. She never locked her door, especially not when I was staying over. Sarah, I called louder now, pounding on the door. No response. The house felt colder, darker somehow, like the light I had turned on in the living room was fading. And then I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it wasn't on the window. It was on the walls. A slow, deliberate knock knock knock, moving around me, circling. I was shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip on the lamp. Anna, the voice whispered, louder now, echoing through the house. You should have stayed with me. I ran. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just needed to get out. I bolted to the front door, threw it open, and sprinted into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until I reached the edge of the street, where the first few houses of the neighborhood came into view. Only then did I stop, bending over, gasping for air, my heart threatening to beat out of my chest. I turned back toward my friend's house, and it stood there, still and quiet, like nothing had happened. But the light in the guest room was on now. I hadn't left it all. I didn't go back inside. I couldn't. I waited in the cold until the sun started to rise. They walked to the nearest coffee shop, shaking the whole way. I texted Sarah over and over, asking if she was okay, but she never responded. Later that morning, I called the police, telling them I had heard someone in the house. They agreed to do a welfare check, but when they got there, they found nothing. No sign of Sarah, no signs of forced entry. It was like she had vanished. The only thing they found was the note on the coffee table. They bagged it as evidence, but I doubt it'll help. The handwriting wasn't hers, and it wasn't mine. I don't know whose it was. That was 3 days ago. I've been staying at a motel ever since, too afraid to go home or even tell anyone else what's happening. But last night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard it again. That same voice, soft and distant but unmistakable. This happened about 2 years ago, and it still gives me chills every time I think about it. I was a college student living off campus in a small, quiet town. My apartment was just a short drive from campus, but my part-time job often kept me out late. That night was no different. I left work around 10:30 p.m., tired and ready to crash. I had parked my car in the far corner of the lot earlier that day, where the street lights barely reached. It was quieter there, and I didn't mind the walk. But as I approached my car, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A man was standing next to it. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, leaning against the driver's side door like he owned it. He was dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans, his face obscured by the shadows. I slowed down and pretended to check my phone, hoping he'd leave, but he didn't move. Instead, he turned his head slightly, like he was watching me out of the corner of his eye. "Oh, excuse me," I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "That's my car." He didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. I considered turning around and going back into the store, but my phone was nearly dead, and I didn't want to be stuck there all night. Taking a deep breath, I decided to approach. As I got closer, I noticed something even stranger. He wasn't just leaning against my car, he was gripping the handle of the driver's side door. His knuckles were white, like he was holding on for dear life. "Ted," I said louder, trying to sound angry. "What are you doing?" Finally, he looked at me. His face was pale and gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days. His eyes, though, that's what really got me. They were wide and bloodshot, filled with a kind of frantic desperation I can't even describe. "Don't get in the car," he said, his voice trembling. "Please." I froze. "What are you talking about?" He shook his head violently, still gripping the handle. "You can't go in there. It's in the back seat. It's waiting for you." My blood ran cold. I took a step back, instinctively glancing toward my car's back seat. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see inside, but his words made my heart race. "Who's in the back seat?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes darting between me and the car like he was fighting some internal battle. Then, without another word, he let go of the handle and bolted across the parking lot, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, completely frozen, until a car drove by and its headlights illuminated my car's interior. My back seat was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got into the car as quickly as I could, locked the doors, and drove home with my heart pounding the entire way. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the unease. Every time I walked to my car, day or night, I felt like someone or something was watching me. I told a few friends about the incident, but their reactions were mixed. Most thought the guy was just a drug addict or someone mentally unstable. A couple of them teased me, saying I'd been chosen by a ghost. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging fear. One night, about a month later, I was at a small get-together at my friend Kayla's apartment. After a few drinks, the creepy parking lot story came up. Everyone started sharing their own weird encounters, and I was starting to feel a little better. Maybe my experience wasn't as strange as I made it out to be. That's when Kayla's boyfriend, Mike, cut in. "Hold on," he said, setting his beer down. "Did you say the guy told you not to get in your car because of something in the backseat?" I nodded, subtly feeling uneasy. "Yeah, why?" Mike leaned back, looking serious for once. "That's actually not as uncommon as you think. There's this urban legend, well, maybe it's more than that, about people seeing things in their backseats. It usually happens late at night when they're alone. Some of them describe it as a person, others as something else." "Something else?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "Yeah," he said, "like shadows that move on their own, or faces that disappear when they turn around." The freaky part is, in a lot of these stories, someone tries to warn them beforehand, like a random stranger or a homeless guy. And every time, the warning is the same: don't get in the car. The room fell silent. "Okay, but that's just an urban legend, right?" Kayla said, rolling her eyes. "You can't seriously believe that." Mike shrugged. But think about it. How many times do people actually check their back seats? If something was there, you wouldn't even know until it was too late. That thought stuck with me. A few weeks later, it happened again. I was leaving campus after a late study session around midnight. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a couple of cars scattered here and there. I made my way to my car, clutching my backpack and trying not to think about the last time I'd been alone like this. When I got to my car, I froze. The driver's side door was open, just slightly. My first thought was that I must have forgotten to lock it, but that didn't make sense. I was obsessive about locking my car after what had happened. My second thought was worse. Someone had broken in. I stood there, heart racing, trying to decide what to do. Then I remembered Mike's words. Slowly, I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. Keeping a safe distance, I pointed the beam into the backseat. Nothing, just my jacket and a few empty water bottles. I let out a shaky breath and laughed at myself for being so paranoid. But as I reached out to close the door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the inside of the window, right above the backseat, were 4 long, smudged streaks like someone had dragged their fingers down the glass. I didn't stick around to investigate. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and drove straight to my friend's house. I couldn't bring myself to go home that night. Since then, I've never parked in that lot again. I've never stayed out late alone, either. I don't know what the man in the parking lot saw that night, or what he thought he saw, but I'll always be grateful for his warning, because sometimes I think about what might have happened if I hadn't listened. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.